Haven't you heard? Eve is dying. In fact, it is still dying. It has been dying since it was published in 2003. So it has been dying for 19 years. That is a very, very long tenure for an MMO. And through EVE Online's entire history, Eve is dying has become something of a meme. But guess what? Everything is dying. All things come to an end, whether it be games, empires, nations, stories, and even humans like you and me. But I'm not dead yet.
He's not dead yet, my Lord Chamberlain.
And neither is EVE Online. Story of EVE Online's demise has been greatly exaggerated for a long time. And I'll get real with you. For the last few years, there has definitely been some cause for concern. In a moment, we will go into some detail about EVE Online's history, rises and falls over the last 15 years or so, but first, we have to do it in the context of other games. Although Eve is old, in fact, there's legacy code in there that is still ancient, thanks to years of iterative updates, it is still very much a modern game, and graphically, it is still top-notch compared to other games. There are a lot of space and sci-fi games to choose from out there, plenty of alternatives to Eve that people can sink their teeth into, and in spite of all that, there is still nothing quite like the scale and scope of EVE Online. Nothing that compares to its complexity, gameplay, strategies, tricks, secrets, and especially player-to-player interactivity. I could go on and on about this. Now, for sure, Eve is not for everyone, nor should it try to be. This game is for a niche player base, the kind of player that is beckoned by its rich complexity. There is no upper limit to how much you can challenge yourself in various forms of gameplay, and to a point where the game can sometimes be stressful. Some people like that. It's what keeps them coming back for more, even if terrible things happen to them in the game. So there has finally been a major update called Eve Uprising. This kind of update is a bit of a departure from the way CCP Games has been updating the game for the last several years. They seem to be going back to a large update and release format like they used to do about 6 or 7 years ago. They used to put out these major updates every year to 6 months, but later they went to an iterative change format with many small patches and then quarterly patches. The problem with small patches is sometimes it's hard for the players to notice a major change or improvement to the game. It is far more interesting to make ready a major release, one that you can promote the hell out of through FanFest and a myriad of ads, which gets a lot of those bitter vet players to return to the game. Let's go back in time for a bit, shall we? This is the server status and player count graph over EVE Online's lifetime. It shows how many players are logged into the game. You can see a steady rise here in the beginning as the game is built and developed. You can clearly see in 2009 through 2012, Eve was at its peak and maintained an extremely healthy online player count. What happened in 2009? Wormholes were introduced, and all the gameplay involved with them, which added thousands of new star systems outside the Stargate network, only accessible through these mysterious portals in space. This led to years of developing gameplay. The players were driven to explore and find resources that led to new technology and ships no one had ever seen before. This was also during an era when CCP Games released large epic updates for Eve. New and interesting ships were introduced on the regular. Then came the free-to-play revolution in MMO gaming. Suddenly, subscription-based MMOs like Eve faced competition from much cheaper alternatives that were often completely free. Also, the burden of new player retention became more apparent. Many aspects of Eve were focused on retaining those players, even if it meant dumbing down some gameplay, such as scanning and exploration. So then Eve struggled for a bit, and then there is this spike in 2016 when Citadels were introduced, another major change to the game. Players could deploy a massive space station of their own, not some weird spindly control tower, where separate modules were like before, but a real station with specialties such as engineering, refining, or defense, and even charge tax on market trades that were going through these stations. There's a massive one in Perimeter near Jeddah, a keep star. These keep stars are kind of like massive Death Star-sized castles in space. In some ways, this centralized the Eve economy, and it added a lot of utility for player-owned space outside the protected NPC empires. In most respects, this was good content for the game, although it certainly did change the player-driven economy in Eve, and how wars are fought as well. After this, there were many other important storyline additions, such as the Drifters, Mordu's Legion's faction, Abyssal Dead Space, the Triglavians, a myriad of small things, but none of these really jump-started the player activity. Now in 2020, there was a bit of a shakeup during the nullsec blackout, where all of player-owned space was, for a very short time, unable to use the local chat system, where players can talk to each other and see who's in the system with them, although this has been a feature in wormholes since the beginning. And the Drifters, scary Spaceborg necromancer things, invade nullsec. The Drifter incursion killed a few player-owned structures and caused some challenges in general nullsec gameplay. And to me, this didn't seem like much of an effect at all, but it illustrated how delicate the Eve universe can be, especially in player-owned space, because many thousands of nullsec players docked up and were too frustrated, afraid, spoiled to play perhaps. They would wait out the blackout, and many of them never returned. Later, in high security space, the Triglavian invasion occurs, and I thought this was excellent content, as one could either help the invasion or fight against it. This culminated in the Triglavians taking several systems from the empires of Eve and creating their own region called Pochvin. Pretty cool, right? A whole new region to explore in Eve? Not so much. The invasion itself was great in my opinion, but the new region clearly had not been well planned. Much of the content within Pochvin was broken and unbalanced, and it took over a year for the developers to fix a lot of the basic problems there. There was also this thing called the scarcity era for mining and materials. This hit nullsec the hardest, and many older players with massive capital mining ships called rorquals suddenly found themselves without their primary source of income. Also consider that there has been a land war going on in Eastern Europe for almost a year now. The Russians, Slavic countries, and Eastern Europeans really love this game, so that's a huge block of players that are having issues getting into the game and playing regularly for various reasons. Oh yes, I almost forgot. The subscription price increased not too long ago. The month-to-month subscription for Eve, which in my opinion is the only way to play Eve to its fullest, was increased to $20. Now you can sometimes get around this by paying for longer term subscriptions or working the promos, or if you're space rich in the game, which few people really are space rich enough for this, you can subscribe using your own in-game money. But still, this is a significant increase. Now, I believe that there were valid reasons for a lot of these changes, but for the last 2 years there hasn't been much of anything new or anticipated in the game other than a lot of back-end stuff that nobody really notices. Until now, perhaps. Now, finally, CCP Games has ended the resource scarcity era with much rejoice and released the first major update in years, Eve Uprising. This is pretty much a 2-part release, with the first part already released this November and the next part releasing in the first quarter of 2023. So we are finally seeing a nice spike in player activity after this release, one that we haven't seen in over a year now. So what is it? I'll give you the short version. And will the increase in player activity last? The most important change is a much needed update to faction warfare, driven by interesting story-based events. What is faction warfare? Well, the major 4 empires mostly enjoy an uneasy peace, but they do enlist players or capsuleers to fight for them in certain parts of low security space in these sort of proxy wars. This is an excellent way for players to get into PvP. They have added a frontline system that pays out more loyalty points and rewards the closer you are to the border of the enemy-controlled systems. Whereas before, the side that controlled most systems no matter where they were fighting would get the greatest reward, leaving little incentive to fight for the losing side. Plus they added a lot of new sites and content to the faction war zones. This moves the story of the Eve universe forward while making the player base feel like they are taking part in its outcome to some degree. This is very much like when wormholes were first introduced, leading to years of solid player numbers, and also very much like the more recent Triglavian invasion, although the end result of that invasion was underwhelming. There are now docking animations and various graphic updates for the interior of player-owned stations. Now every ship has a docking and undocking animation, and if you have other ships in that station, you can see them in the docks next to you. This does not apply to the NPC stations though. Hopefully someday we'll get those updates as well. And finally, there's the new heraldry system. This is an update to the graphics for your starship. While it is true that Eve has had all kinds of ship skins for some time, now there are holograms and various graphics for Corp and Alliance logos, and in the next release we'll have a lot more holographic items to customize your ship, with things such as PvP kill marks. In fact, the next part of this much anticipated release for 2023 will introduce a new allegiance system. Currently, to participate in faction warfare, you must be in a corporation or alliance that is completely enlisted, an all-or-nothing approach. But soon you will be able to participate in faction warfare without your entire corp being enlisted, so you don't have to leave your friends to participate. This will no doubt allow a lot of players to participate in faction warfare that would not otherwise. Oh, and finally, there are more ships. There are now Navy or fleet variants of several baseline destroyers, battlecruisers, and even dreadnoughts. Now, will this last? I have to be honest, I don't know. However, I feel that the designers at CCP Games have a much improved outlook compared to the last several years. I feel as if the current updates are elegant and effective. Because the MMO games industry is somewhat competitive and harder to maintain than ever, I'm not sure if Eve will ever get the numbers it enjoyed back in 2010. Does that mean it's dead? Finished? No, not by a long shot. Well, that's all I have to say on this. Until next time, Space Friends, if you're interested in contacting me in-game, have a look at the description below. Even if it meant dumbing down some retake. The Drifters, Mordor's Legions factions, retake. Paying for a long-term subscription, or if you're space rich, you can actually use the in-game retake. While it is true Eve has had all kinds of skins for some time, retake. While it is true Eve has had some retake. While it is true that Eve has had all kinds of ship skins for some time, retake. While it is true that Eve retake.